As we head towards midnight and overnight, we see the low cloud pushing
First and foremost, I'm a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the people's channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The people's channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Every Sunday from 11. Join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have
Good evening and welcome back. It's just gone 6 o'clock. I'm Bethany Elsey with your top stories from the GB newsroom. Dorset police have named the 17-year-old boy who died after getting into difficulty in the water off Bournemouth Beach on Wednesday. Joe Abus from Southampton died after being pulled from the sea. In a statement, his family said they were heartbroken and devastated, describing him as a fabulous young man. A 12-year-old girl named in reports as Suna Khan from High Wycombe in Buckinghamshire also died in the incident, which involved 10 swimmers. A sightseeing boat named the Dorset Belle has been impounded by police. A man has been charged after allegedly wearing a shirt to the FA Cup final yesterday, which appeared to have an offensive reference to the Hillsborough disaster. 33-year-old James White from Warwickshire has been charged with displaying threatening or abusive writing. He's expected to appear at Willesden Magistrates Court next week. 97 Liverpool fans died in 1989 at Hillsborough Stadium in Sheffield. Indian authorities say a signal problem was likely responsible for the country's worst train crash in decades. The number of people who were killed in the accident has now been revised down to 275. Another 1,200 were injured when a passenger train hit a stationary freight train before derailing and striking a second passenger train. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has vowed to punish anyone found responsible. The Immigration Minister has told GB News it's wrong for migrants to demand better hotel accommodation while waiting for their asylum claims to be processed. It's after a protest was sparked in London by migrants being asked to sleep 4 to a room. Speaking to Camilla Tominey, Robert Jenrick said the government will never put their interests above the British public. He also said sharing hotel rooms is necessary to get value for taxpayers' money.
Remember, these are migrants who have said they are destitute. They've said that they have absolutely nowhere to stay, no friends, no family, no money, and the taxpayer is stepping up and providing them with good quality accommodation and board and lodgings. And so, you know, I think those migrants are wrong to protest and say that they deserve to have single bedrooms with ensuite bathrooms and so on. And I'm pleased to see that common sense seems to have prevailed in this case.
A Labour MP has told GB News victims are too scared to complain about sexual predators in Parliament. Charlotte Nichols told Camilla Tominey that harassment is baked into every single part of how Westminster operates. She also accused the Labour Party of choosing not to act on concerns raised about a number of colleagues over a very long period. Her comments come after she revealed being handed a list of 30 MPs she should avoid when first becoming an MP.
It's happened to me in meetings during the middle of the working day. I've had colleagues do things like inappropriate touching, you know, their hand on your leg or on your back or making comments towards you. And I'm someone that, as I said, within the hierarchy of Westminster is relatively protected by virtue of being an MP. So how much worse it must be if you're someone who has less power in the institution, where you're more likely to experience it and even less able to speak out when it happens.
The Duke of Sussex will appear at the High Court tomorrow to give evidence against the publisher of the Daily Mirror over alleged unlawful information gathering. Harry claims around 140 published articles contained information gathered using unlawful methods, including phone hacking. Mirror Group Newspapers is contesting the claims. You're up to date on TV, online, DAB+ radio and on TuneIn. This is GB News. Now it's time for Camilla Tominey.
Good morning and welcome to the Camilla Tominey Show on this sunny Sunday. Lovely to have your company. We have got an absolutely bumper show. I'm joined now by Bob Seeley, the Tory MP for the Isle of Wight, who describes the Tory party's resident Ukraine expert, which is what we want to start this conversation on. Look, how do you think the war's going and how do you foresee it ending?
How you foresee it ending is another question entirely. How the war's going, OK, it's going badly for the Russians, but the idea that the Russians have lost is not true. And we're buying into the idea of Russian defeat too early. Russia still occupies 20% of Ukraine. And if they keep occupying that for the next year or two, then actually Putin is winning. So the idea that Putin's lost this war, I don't buy. And actually, if Putin's agenda is to create a Russia which is viscerally hostile and angry and full of hatred towards the West, and to reshape Russian identity to be profoundly anti-Western, he's sort of doing quite well in Russia. Yes. Now, that may all come crashing down. His regime may come crashing down, but it hasn't yet. When it comes to arming the Ukrainians, we've got to continue to do so. But the big sort of collapse of the Russian front, especially in the south, it may not happen because the Russians are dug in so many different lines that it's going to be very difficult to break through all those lines. Although the Ukrainians, you know, they've got the motivation, they've got the morale. They're much better now at doing maneuver warfare, which is effectively modern warfare, where you combine stuff. So they're going to do well this summer, I hope. How well is the great question.
You say they've got the motivation and indeed they've got the spirit, but do they have the weaponry? Has the EU or EU countries been found wanting in supplying weapons to Ukraine?
Probably yes, because the Americans... Look, we're doing lots of great stuff there and we led the way, and actually congratulations to the previous Boris government and to Rishi's government. but it's the Americans that are supplying about 85% of the kit. And considering the European Union's economic size, our ability to support the Ukrainians, I think, has been pretty poor. I mean, when I say our, I'm talking about Europe as a whole. I think we've been pretty good. The Americans have been pretty good. But I think Europe's been lacking, and everything has taken time to come out, and it's way too slow.
I wonder what you made of James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, tweeting in the week that Ukraine's rightful place is in NATO. Do you agree with that?
Up to a point. I just, for me, this could escalate in a much more dangerous way, this war. Whether it's attacking Western pipelines or 70 internet cables or the 5 interconnectors, the electricity supply lines between us and Europe. And
do you think that's a really credible threat?
For sure, yes, I do. And I also think we underestimate the potential for Russia to use tactical nuclear weapons. I did a study for the Heritage Institute a few months ago, and there was a recent study put out by a retired US general that says actually the likelihood of using this is higher than we think.
Really?
Yeah, I mean...
That's horrifying.
It is horrifying. On the balance of probabilities, the Russians probably won't do it because of the Chinese and the Indians would effectively withdraw their support significantly. But if Putin always escalates out of a crisis, how is he going to escalate out of this crisis apart from another round of mobilization and more artillery and more strikes on Kiev and other Ukrainian cities, which isn't working?
Was Cleverly naive to make this statement then?
I think we should park NATO membership. Ukraine is safe, not when it becomes a paper member of an organisation, but actually when it's got the ability to defend itself, whether it's got the kit, when it's got the kit to defend itself, and when it's got the military intellectual firepower to use that kit in the most effective way possible, which it is learning.
I mean, but
that is when it's going to be safe.
The severing of undersea cables, just to explain to the viewership and the listenership, you know, these are cables which carry all of our data. I mean, the entire country is completely disabled.
Yeah.
And I know there has been some evidence of some degree of attempts to tamper, but just tell us about the threat of that particularly.
For sure. There are 70 comms cables between us, Europe and North America and elsewhere in the world. There are 3 gas supply lines, one from Norway, which is a critical one, and there are 5 electricity interconnectors. If these are sabotage, and we're never going to... The idea that we're going to know it's the Russians who've done it, I think is going to be really difficult. And you cannot go to war. You cannot say that we would have a military response to this without being so sure it was the Russians. And you can suspect it, but unless you've got that proof, no government is going to take military action or decisive action against the Russians should our supply lines be cut. But if any of those 70 cables are cut, we will start noticing it. The City of London will start noticing it. The City of London will say we can't operate.
But do we have the capacity
we
to
don't
take any military action against Russia, even if we wanted to?
We do, but I mean, in the great scheme of things, would you want to be doing that? No. You may want to up your support to Ukraine still further. You may then want to supply either Swedish Gripen planes or F-16s. But again, you're getting into increasingly dangerous territory. Our problem is we won't be able to find it because we've got one ship that is specialising in defending undersea cables, and it's not yet been commissioned.
One ship?
Yeah. We may have 2. It's being commissioned at the moment, and there's talk about getting a second one. No, we have subs and we have vessels that can do that. But I mean, this is the problem with our defence spending, is that there's no redundancy in the system, and we live in much more dangerous times, and that's been increasingly clear over the last 10 years.
What share of GDP should defence spending be? I know Truss advocated 3%. Would you advocate more?
I would advocate more than we're doing at the moment, but it's not a question of how much money, because you can spend that money very badly, as we know, on procurement, where, you know, it's still a national scandal. I mean, some of our kit is billions over budget and still doesn't work and gives you sort of backache and hearing problems if you're using it.
Doesn't give the electorate much confidence, any of this, Bob?
No, it's not great. I mean, look, the procurement in the MOD has been a scandal for years, and to Ben Wallace's credit, he is now trying to solve this. But this stuff is now being...
move and be the head of NATO with all of this happening on home soil and concerns about our own defences?
I think Ben Wallace would be a great head of NATO. I think he's highly capable, and if there's somebody who deserves that job, who we know would do it very well, I think it is absolutely Ben Wallace.
And you could then replace him as Defence Secretary.
Well, that's very kind, very unlikely.
Let's move on to other matters. You saw the scoop in the Telegraph on Saturday about this counter-disinformation unit, effectively spying on lockdown critics. We've got one coming in later, Molly Kingsley. This is almost sort of Soviet-style Stasi techniques of spying on people who dissented and didn't think that schools should be closed or wear face masks. They're not conspiracy theorists, are they, Bob? Why were they being spied on?
And the problem is there is a conspiracy theorist fringe. I don't buy their arguments in any way, shape or form, but there was a role for intelligent debate. And there was a role for listening to different experts during COVID. And what has really depressed me about this was the way that the government, and it's a government I was supporting, which is even more frustrating. You'd expect it from Labour. You shouldn't expect this thing from the Conservatives. We had a government that effectively was very hostile to dissent and was saying it was listening to experts, but the only experts it was listening to were people who effectively, like from Imperial College, who were producing extraordinarily questionable data, which is since, if my understand...
data.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, if I'm ever a minister during a crisis, my first instinct is not to listen to anything put out by Imperial College.
Should Baroness Hallett look at all this as well as everything else?
Look, the problem with Baroness Hallett, I just think the inquiry is going to cost about $250 million and it's going to achieve absolutely nothing. The Swedes have already delivered their inquiry.
Is this inquiry just taking too long? We might not hear back from her. She said she needs another 3 years to assess all the data.
3 years, and by then I can guarantee we won't have learnt the lesson. The big lesson is, the big question for me is not why didn't we go into lockdown earlier? The big question is why did we experiment with lockdown in the first place?
Or why did we engage in mass groupthink rather than...
Absolutely, and it's maybe because China locked down me, because Italy locked down me, because we were spooked by the highly questionable Imperial College stats that came out, which are now being, as I say, being significantly questioned as to their likely accuracy. We had a pandemic response model. It's what the Swedes did. OK? It costs them a lot less, but even more importantly, we have now got, between 10 and 20,000 excess deaths
2020,
every year.
Should we have been more Swedish?
Yes, we should. And, I say that as someone who voted for the first couple of lockdowns and became sceptical, frankly, too late in the day.
We've only got a minute left, Bob. Let's have a chat about the Tories. Can they win in 2024?
Yes, we can.
People talking about Boris still on the doorstep?
No, they're not. I was out in a place called Wootton Creek yesterday. There's a lovely patch in the Isle of Wight, and people are not talking about Boris. I know the Westminster media love to talk about him. The folks on the doorstep, they've moved on.
Do they want taxes to be cut? Do you want taxes to be cut?
Yes, they do. And what we need is a Conservative government which is in line with the British people. They think that political correctness, they don't like it. They want us to be proud of our history. They want us to deliver tax cuts and job creation, and they want us to train up people here rather than relying on...
Toryism or left-wing Toryism?
I'd say more conservative Toryism.
More conservative conservatism.
Yeah.
We love that, Bob. Thank you very much indeed. Lovely to see you this morning. Thank you very, very much for joining me. Now, lots more to come on the show. Just after the break, I'll be speaking to Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick, and I'll be asking why the government have failed in tackling both legal and illegal immigration. Plus, I'm going to be speaking to Labour MP Charlotte Nichols, who's taking on her own party over what she sees as a failure to tackle sexual misconduct within Parliament. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back soon.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Now, do not move a muscle, because I'm going to be speaking to Robert Jenrick, the Immigration Minister, in just a moment, and asking him whether the government have failed in tackling legal and illegal migration. Charlotte Nichols, the Labour MP for Warrington North, is also going to be joining me. She's going to be taking on her own party over sexual misconduct in Parliament. And I'm going to be joined in the studio by Molly Kingsley. She's the founder of the campaign group Us For Them, who it has been revealed was spied on by the government for campaigning against school closures during the pandemic. And Cindy Jackson, once dubbed Britain's most surgically enhanced woman, who's now taking on the plastic surgery industry, will be discussing with me her new book, How Not to Get Botched. Now, I hope that Robert Jenrick, the Immigration Minister and the Tory MP for Newark, can hear me. Robert, thank you very much for joining me this morning. Now, I know you've been writing about this in the Telegraph,
Camilla.
but do migrants have a right to complain about the conditions that they're housed in hotels when they're seeking asylum here?
Well, Camilla, I'll always try to treat economic migrants and asylum seekers with dignity and decency, but I'll never put the interests of migrants above those of the British public. And in this case, the Home Office offered perfectly good accommodation to asylum seekers in central London, and some, for a short time, said that it didn't meet their requirements. But I'm pleased to see that common sense prevailed, and most, if not all of them, ended up using the accommodation. We've got to stop using hotels altogether, reduce our reliance on them. The only sustainable way to do that is to stop the boats in the first place and secure our borders. But for as long as we are using them, we've got to get value for money for the taxpayer.
But they're complaining about 2 metres not being enough space for 4 migrants. I mean, they may have a point there. Would you like to overnight in a 2-metre squared space?
Well, we'll always meet legal obligations, and there are space standards in hotels and other forms of accommodation. But we have to get value for money for the taxpayer. It is wrong that we're spending £6 million a day on hotels. And so it's right that we make sure that those hotels that we do use, and I say we want to reduce our reliance on them as rapidly as we can, but whilst we are using them, we get good value for money for the taxpayer. And remember, these are migrants who have said they are destitute. They've said that they have absolutely nowhere to stay, no friends, no family, no money, and the taxpayer is stepping up and providing them with good quality accommodation and board and lodgings. And so, I think those migrants are wrong to protest and say that they deserve to have single bedrooms with ensuite bathrooms and so on. And I'm pleased to see that common sense seems to have prevailed in this case.
The idea of all of these migrants flooding into hotels across the UK is the government's fault, really, isn't it? I mean, there's an astonishing figure today suggesting that you're still to process the asylum claims of 17,000 Albanians. What on earth were they doing coming to this country claiming asylum in the first place when they're coming from a safe country? The whole reason why this has happened, as far as GB viewers and listeners are concerned, is because the government has completely lost a grip on this issue. No, that's not a fair analysis. There's a European migration challenge,
There are millions of people on the move around the world, and all European countries are facing very large numbers of illegal migrants. I've just been in France, in Italy, and then in North Africa, in countries like Tunisia and Algeria, and the challenge is very great. But that is why we need to take the kind of robust action that we are. And we have put in place, in the last 6 months, under Rishi Sunak, Suella Braverman and myself, one of the most comprehensive and robust plans of any major European country. We've signed 2 important agreements with France. There's going to mean more interceptions on the beaches. In fact, 33,000 illegal migrants have been stopped on beaches in France in the last year alone, a 40% increase on the year before. We've now got a gold standard returns agreement with Albania. That means there are now weekly flights sending people back to Albania.
Minister, when will you deport somebody to Rwanda? I mean, you say that you've got this gold standard. That's not how it feels from the voters' point of view. They feel that there's a lack of control of our borders. They're worried about the legal migration figure of 606,000 when David Cameron put a cap on numbers at 100,000. So it's not a gold standard. It's great that you've been jet-setting around to see and share best practice, but when are we going to see migrants deported to Rwanda? Can you give us a date?
Well, we'll get those flights going to Rwanda as soon as we get through the courts.
When will that be?
And we're getting the bill through Parliament. Well, I can't give you a date because we don't know when we'll hear from the courts, but I'm very pleased that the High Court resoundingly supported the government's policy, said it was legal. All of those people who said it wasn't were proven wrong. The Court of Appeal have heard our case. We're waiting for their judgment. We will get those flights in the air as soon as we possibly can. And the bill that I'm piloting through Parliament fundamentally changes the system, because you can't just tinker with this system. It is today, there is flagrant abuse of the system. We need an entirely different one. And the system that we're building is one where if you come illegally, you will not be allowed to stay here.
Can you put some figures on it then? There were 45,000 people coming in illegally across the channel last year. What number should that be reduced to? And on this 606,000 legal immigrants, what should that number be capped at?
Well, on illegal migration and the boats, we've been as clear as possible. We said we want to stop the boats. We want to stop people making these crossings.
So will that figure be to zero
next year? We're taking action on every possible front. Well, I want to stop the boats. I mean, that is what I'm working day and night on with the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary. We want to stop people making these dangerous and unnecessary crossings, and that's why we're taking action diplomatically with the new bill that's going through Parliament. That's why we're boosting funding for the police. That's why I was in North Africa this week, so we're getting the National Crime Agency to be smashing the gangs before people get anywhere near the UK. And on legal migration, it is far too high, and I want to see it come down. Illegal migration on this scale is unsustainable. Well, we've said very clearly that we want to see it fall. I want to see it fall substantially because it's putting pressure on housing, on public services, on integration, and businesses, although of course we need to show flexibility, need to be helping British workers to get into the workplace, to help people to train and get the skills they need, rather than reaching for the easy lever of foreign labour.
So are you happy to have a cap?
That's what the government's committed to doing.
Are you happy to have a cap, and what should it be?
Well, I don't think that arbitrary caps and targets are particularly helpful. What I do think is important is that now that we have, well, because migration is constantly changing, we need the flexibility to respond to changes in the economy or in patterns of behaviour. But the good news is that we've now got control of our borders after leaving the European Union. We've created the points-based system. And unlike all of those previous governments who made promises that they couldn't keep because of free movement, we have the ability now to make changes. And so 2 weeks ago, we made one of those changes, which is to say that if you are a university student coming here from overseas on a short course, you won't be able to bring dependents with you. And that will reduce substantially the number of people coming into this country. And that's just one tangible example of us using the powers that we now have, that we didn't have when we were members of the European Union, to control our migration system. And if we need to take further steps, we will do.
Should we leave the ECHR? One of our People's panellists, Justin, wants me to ask you that question.
Well, the bill that we're piloting through Parliament is compatible with our international law obligations, so I hope that we'll be able to get those flights off to Rwanda and address this issue within the current framework. But look, we've said that we'll do what's necessary to stop the boats because the public want us to secure our borders. And the international frameworks that were created after the Second World War are now out of date and need to be renewed and reimagined for an age of mass migration. That's what the UK is doing. We are a leader in this field. We've created our Rwanda policy, and other governments, including in Europe, are looking to it with interest and seeing that the UK is taking very robust action to tackle this problem.
Minister Elon Musk, the head of Twitter and indeed Tesla, has described the Telegraph story talking about the counter-disinformation unit spying on lockdown critics as terrible. Do you agree with him? This needs to be investigated, doesn't it?
Well, I believe in free speech. I don't believe in governments or other people clamping down on the ability of individuals to speak their mind on the issues of the day.
Why was the government sanctioning social media companies to silence those who were critical of lockdown?
Well, as I understand it, the story isn't correct, and that this unit did not take action against any individual, that there was a very clear policy that no journalist or politician should ever be monitored.
But that didn't happen, did it, Mr. Jenrick? Because we had a situation where David Davis had given a speech talking about the efficacy of face masks, and Facebook took it down without any justification. We've got social media companies constantly monitoring output and making arbitrary decisions about perfectly legitimate journalistic stories. So what we've got is an over-monitoring of free speech in this country. That must really worry you as a Conservative.
Yeah, I believe in free speech. I want politicians, members of the public, you as a journalist, to be able to speak your mind without fear or favour. As I understand it, this unit within the Cabinet Office did not monitor specific individuals, but on the broader point, we believe in free speech as a government. That's one of the great tenets of this country, and we should always fight for that.
Minister, final question on Boris Johnson, who we can never quite leave behind, even though the government might move on. He's suggesting, or at least his allies are suggesting, that Rishi Sunak doesn't want to hand over his WhatsApp messages to the Baroness Hallett inquiry into COVID because he's got something to hide. Has he got something to hide, Mr. Jenrick?
No, what we've said is that we will hand over to the inquiry absolutely anything that has got anything to do with COVID-19 or the purpose of the inquiry. Where there is a small disagreement is around handing over documents or messages that have got nothing, absolutely nothing, to do with COVID. And as a former lawyer, I've been involved in these discovery exercises in the past, and what courts do in these situations is ask individuals or businesses to hand over documents that are relevant to the inquiry or the case.
Thank you very much indeed for your time this morning.
Thank you.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
So Dubes & Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate. Both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Channel.
Now, I'm delighted to be joined by Charlotte Nichols, who's the Labour MP for Warrington North. She's raised some serious concerns about the treatment of female MPs in Parliament. Charlotte, let me just start with a simple question. Are female MPs safe to work in Parliament?
I don't think that female MPs are, but I think that the people that are most at risk are parliamentary staff, particularly young women and young gay men or men perceived to be gay, who have the least power in the institution, are the most at risk and have the least form of redress of any of us.
And you've raised concerns particularly about your own party's handling of misconduct complaints, of sexual abuse complaints. That's obviously following Geraint Davies being investigated. Do you think that Labour's got a woman problem or a hypocrisy problem? What's the deal here with your own party?
I think the issue of sexual harassment and sexual misconduct is unfortunately baked into every single part of how the institution of Westminster operates. No party has clean hands on this. But one of the things that I'm concerned about is that I do expect my own party to be better, and we're not having the ability to have the moral high ground at the moment because we can't even keep our own house in order. And on a personal level and a professional level, I find it deeply, deeply upsetting. And frankly, if people aren't willing to call their own parties out, but they're willing to point fingers at other parties, you don't actually care about sexual harassment or sexual misconduct. You care about scoring political points.
And Charlotte, when you say that about keeping your own house in order, what do you mean? That women come forward and they're not taken seriously, they're fobbed off, they're told, oh, well, unfortunately, that's just what Westminster's like. What's the sort of environment if you do make a complaint?
I think the main thing is that within Westminster are whips, the party as an institution, and Westminster as an institution hides behind processes that don't work as a reason for inaction. There have been concerns raised about a number of colleagues over a very long period, and the party have always said that they can't do anything about it in the absence of a formal complaint. And yet, miraculously, when the news about Geraint broke the other day, the party were able to take action and suspend him before a formal complaint had been made. So when they haven't done that in other cases that they know full well about, they're choosing not to act.
But when you say full well about, I mean, obviously we know situations where there are rumours that precede a complaint, but you do have to wait for the complaint to be lodged. Otherwise, we might enter into territory where some MPs are just the victim of a political witch hunt.
I don't think that is the case. And one of the things that we do see is that because of the way that the systems in Westminster, as I said, 3 failing systems, you have the Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme, which is the parliamentary scheme, you have the party scheme, and you have going to the police as your options if you have experienced something. But one of the main issues with all three of those things is that unless the person that it directly happened to is willing to make a report, and there's a million reasons why someone might not feel able to at the time that it happens, even people who witnessed it aren't able to come forward, let alone people who've been told something by another person about what someone did to them. You can't unknow that information, but you're not empowered to do anything with it through those structures and systems that we've got. And that's the thing that makes people really unsafe within Westminster, because you know about people that are predators, frankly,
yes,
and they are allowed to continue walking about the place because sometimes their victims are so scared of coming forward that effectively they've got free rein to continue doing it.
Charlotte, I can hear in your voice how passionate you are about this issue and how personally you are feeling it. Have you personally been failed by the system? Can you tell me anything about that without intruding too much into your own privacy?
Yeah, I mean, I've raised concerns with my whips about a number of colleagues. I've mentioned previously that when I first came into Parliament, I was given a list of about 30 MPs to stay away from. This was people that I should never accept a drink from, should never be alone with, should never get in a car with or in a lift with. And this was MPs from all different parties, including a handful from my own. And as much as I found that shocking at the time, you know, that's approximately 5% of my colleagues that I've been told that I'm not safe around. I really thought, as someone who is a member of Parliament and within the institution and hierarchy of Westminster is relatively high up and protected because of that, how much worse it would be if you're a junior member of staff, if you're an intern, if you're a junior reporter in the lobby who comes into Parliament in your first week and is told a thing.
When you said about not accepting drinks, the suggestion was being that maybe there could be MPs in Parliament that would be spiking drinks to make their female colleagues more vulnerable?
It's not just female colleagues, it's, as I said, young gay men and men perceived to be gay as well. It's something that we have seen happen, and one of the people who is currently not allowed on the parliamentary estate, it's because he was spiking people's drinks and assaulting them.
Is booze in general a problem on the Westminster estate? Do you think, for instance, that alcohol should just not be sold in Westminster?
I think that there is part of the issue where alcohol does play into it, but I think actually the systems and problems run much deeper than that. You have very late night sittings, you have a real blurring of personal and professional boundaries, you have MPs all acting as 650 individual employers for their team, with no real HR support or oversight. All MPs are considered to be self-employed, which means that we're not actually accountable to anyone other than when it comes to election time, our constituents. And all of these sorts of things bake in those problems. Then when you add in the fact that the systems for redress don't work, that's a really toxic combination. But actually the majority of instances that we see of bullying, harassment and sexual harassment actually happen a long way away from parliamentary bars. I've had it where it's happened to me in meetings during the middle of the working day. I've had colleagues do things like inappropriate touching, you know, their hand on your leg or on your back or making comments towards you. And I'm someone that, as I said, within the hierarchy of Westminster is relatively protected by virtue of being an MP. So how much worse it must be if you're someone who has less power in the institution, where you're more likely to experience it and even less able to speak out when it happens.
Have you been discussing this in depth with the Labour leader, Keir Starmer? Is he taking your concerns seriously? What discussions have you had with him about this?
I haven't had any discussions with Keir Starmer about this, although I have spoken to my whips and to other party colleagues on a number of occasions.
Is that because you haven't been able to schedule a meeting with him, or he hasn't taken enough interest? Should he take more interest in this?
I think he should take more interest in it, as I think we should see from our party's leadership within the party. So our General Secretary, for example, our Governance and Legal Unit, all of these bodies that are meant to be responsible for enforcing standards, for making sure that people are behaving in a proper way. Because as much as I've got tons of respect for journalists like Esther Webber, Aggie Chambray, Kat Neelan and others who've been shining a light on this problem recently, it isn't their job make sure that MPs are behaving properly. It's our whips, our parties and Parliament that need to be doing that.
Yes, and isn't there an irony, Charlotte, just to finish, that it's usually the female MPs and indeed female journalists who shine a light on these sorts of stories?
Absolutely, and I hope that our male colleagues will start taking this issue much more seriously rather than leaving it to us to try to sort out.
Thank you very much indeed for your time this morning, Charlotte Nichols. Now, don't go anywhere, because after the Telegraph's bombshell story yesterday, I'm going to be speaking to the mother who was spied on by the British government for campaigning against school closures during the pandemic. Back soon.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference. And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Now, I've been tasting it throughout the show, and I'm delighted now to be joined by Molly Kingsley, who's founder of Us For Them, who campaigned against school closures during the pandemic. Now, as I've said, this is about a Telegraph story talking about how the Counter-Disinformation Unit, that's the government's unit, looking into people who were perhaps critical or sceptical of lockdown, spied on people like Molly.
The first point is it wasn't just me. I mean, there was quite a big group of us, I think, who became aware, not just from Us For Them, actually, but, you know, a group of kind of dissident journalists and outspoken critics who...
I might have been in that group.
I suspect you might have.
Professor Carl Hennigan would have been another. Anyone sort of voicing any concerns about the efficacy of face masks over mass vaccination of children, and not, by the way, in a conspiracy theory way, just saying, is it right that we're vaccinating 9-year-olds? Equally, people who were talking about whether schools should be closed at all, I mean, these are people with perfectly valid opinions. We're not talking about extremists here sending out anti-vax messages.
No, we're not. And actually, it's really interesting that you use that word extreme, because actually what I would say is that many of us were arguing really for the moderate position. So, before 2020, if you had talked about isolating children by themselves for weeks on end, if you talked about, masking children for 8 hours, each day, including in lessons. And if you talked about giving children, a novel medical intervention when there was no real benefit for many of those children, well, actually, that would have been considered an extreme position. Yeah. And what I feel we were doing, my Us For Them colleagues was saying, whoa, no, like this isn't right. The reasonable position here is to challenge, is to ask for the evidence, and is to say, have harms been considered? And actually, it was that view that I think we're seeing was, well, we know it was being spied on, and I think we can infer that there must have been some suppression. I mean, we know that. So our Facebook group, our Us For Them Facebook group, quite frequently had warnings slapped on it saying, you are circulating, you're letting false information into the group. One example was we posted a Daily Mail article. So this is an article that had been in mainstream, and the article had been about masking children and a potential link between carbon dioxide levels and face masks on kids. And we'd shared that, and we'd had a warning slapped on the group saying, your group is in danger of being lost, your group's being suppressed, which means other members won't see it. So, we know that kind of suppression took place. Likewise, on Twitter, I think many of us felt it was very odd that we were saying things that were having an awful lot of traction, it looked like. So, tweets that were being retweeted maybe hundreds of times, and yet follower numbers never went up. It was very weird.
I mean, we're used to kind of seeing dissent on Twitter because I would suggest that it's probably largely left-leaning, and the left seem to go with full lockdown on steroids, and people who are more of a conservative stroke right-wing persuasion were talking a bit more about, civil liberties and all of these concerns. The government, it should be stressed, is denying that social media posts were doctored, deleted, or indeed, I think the word is shadow banned. But it is quite sinister to know that social media companies collaborated with the government over monitoring.
Yes, it is sinister. And I think, although many of us knew it would happen, when I saw the list, so in fact, I've got it here, I don't know if it's picked up on the camera, but you can see it's pages long. And this was mainly...
Is that the organisations that were monitored?
This was just me. So this was just my comments, most of which were either in mainstream press or articles, some of them on Twitter. And, this is just one journalist, and it's not even like I have a huge profile compared to many who would have been monitored. And I think what strikes me about this is it's like what we found out, and what the Telegraph piece yesterday found out, was probably the tip of this vast iceberg. We only know this because a few of us submitted Freedom of Information Act requests, essentially.
And you, subject access requests. You wanted to find out how much data the government held on you individually. What did you find out on that?
Well, this is what you found out.
So that's your whole list of all references.
And if you look, and I've circled a few. And
so it's all sorts of comments that you've made about schools are overacting to the COVID risk. That was a Telegraph article that you wrote. You're flagging, concerns over face masks, whether they work or not. I mean, there's nothing particularly controversial here.
Well, a lot of it is unpalatable opinions. Some of it, I'd say, is fact. So on some occasions, and actually one of my directors, I mean, this is just one of my directors got flagged. I'm just going to read this out, actually, because I think it's really interesting. She says she had been contacted by parents from more than 100 schools. So that's a fact. It was in an article reported in the Telegraph. And Arabella Skinner, my colleague, had said, parents are totally distraught that their children's schools have decided they will continue with masks in class with no end in sight. This was in 2022. Yes. So this was fact, and it was a strong opinion from one of my directors. And actually what the government is flagging here, or what this unit is flagging, is opinions which are unpalatable. This isn't misinformation.
No, also, this is pretty innocuous. Molly Kingsley says it is indefensible that children's lives are still not back to normal when the rest of society is. She urges ministers to make a clear statement that children's extracurricular activities should not be subject to additional curbs.
Have you seen the date?
That's controversial at all. That is the 6th of the 2nd, 2022.
So, you know, this is kids' lives had been disrupted by 2 years. I know, it's unbelievable, isn't it?
Are you going to take any action over this? What position are you in with regard to sort of holding the government to account on this? You could recommend perhaps that Baroness Hallett investigates the counter-disinformation unit as part of the COVID inquiry.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think she has to. And I think the problem with this is you can't undo censorship. And I'm afraid the stark reality is that for the best part of 2 years, you know, we have been living under this condition where one narrative appears to have been being amplified. So, you know, that's a separate issue. But we know that certain news outlets, including the BBC, as you said, have taken a very pro-lockdown view, not platforming people perhaps who are dissenters.
Bearing in mind as well that the BBC had a role in this counter-disinformation unit forum. What do you make of that the state broadcasters involved in this?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And it's sinister. I think this is where it all gets very, very murky. And I think Hallett does need to investigate this. I think there must be accountability. The first thing is we actually don't really know. You know, we're guessing really, aren't we? You know, we can see we were spied on, but as to how much that translated, if at all, into actual censorship, we don't know. We need to understand that. We also need to understand, I think, who within government sanction this. I mean, I find it quite incredible to think that this wasn't sanctioned at ministerial level. Surely it must have been.
Yes.
But I don't think we've yet heard a minister come out and said, you know, this was my brainchild.
No.
Someone needs to explain. And I think only when we have the full facts can we work out what to do about it. But it does seem to me that on its face, this is absolutely anathema to the principles of liberal democracy and free speech. I mean, what is going on here?
Molly Kingsley, thank you very much for coming in and for sharing that paperwork with us. It's fascinating stuff. So I'm joined now by Cindy Jackson. She's just written a new book called How Not to Get Botched. Now, Cindy, I know you've had various monikers over the years in the tabloid press, many of which you just reject and you don't like, described as a human Barbie. People started tottering up how many procedures you had.
I never got botched. I never made mistakes. And I see people nowadays making so many errors in judgment and listening to misinformation that it's not the way I did it. And I would like to help people realize there are better ways, there's a correct way to go about it. Well, little by little, the number of dissatisfied patients has crept up to the point where now it's an epidemic. I mean, it's quite incredible. And when I say botched, I mean people who have spent too much, who just aren't happy, who don't look any different, all the way to people who are disfigured for life.
And when you say disfigured, is that largely from surgical procedures or are we talking about fillers? Because I know you raise serious concerns about fillers in the book.
Yes. Some of the worst problems I've ever seen are from permanent fillers. They can cause systemic infections, which are very, very difficult to deal with.
Now, you say about how not to get botched. What are some of your top tips? If somebody does want to go for a procedure, what's the main piece of advice you give them, the first piece of advice, Cindy?
The biggest problem with people having unsatisfactory procedures is misinformation.
Yeah.
And you need to double check, triple check everything you're told. Don't just see something online and go, oh, I'll act on that. And that is rife, even among really intelligent people who should know better.
A lot of the people you help have gone to qualified surgeons, reputable people, and not kind of flying off to Turkey or wherever to have procedures done.
These are people who thought they did everything right. They thought they did the research. And then when they realized where they went wrong, it was just a basic error. And all these basic errors, there's about 10 of them, are in the book. They're analyzed for people to look at and say, OK, I won't make that mistake.
Can I just say, I'm trying to do the maths. You said you had your first procedures in the 1980s and you were in your mid-30s.
That's right.
Cindy, you're looking good for whatever age you are. Do you want to give me a ballpark?
Late 60s.
Late 60s. Cindy Jackson, honestly. Now, you can get How Not to Get Botched on Cindy's website, as we've just said. I'll be back at next week at 9:30.
Hello there, welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast. I'm Greg Dewhurst, and looking at the next few days, it stays fine and settled, but there are signs of something little hotter and more humid on the way to end the week. But at the moment, high pressure is in charge of our weather, keeping it settled. This low pressure moves towards us, allowing a southerly airstream to develop towards next weekend, increasing risk of some heavy showers. A fine end to Sunday. We are seeing some low cloud across eastern areas push its way inland as we move overnight tonight. Thick enough for the odd spot of drizzle. Clearest skies holding on across western parts of the UK, and under those clear skies temperatures could dip to mid to low single figures, holding up in the east where it is a grey start to Monday morning. Low cloud also affecting Midlands, perhaps even eastern parts of Wales. But through the morning and into the afternoon we should see that low cloud lift and break back towards the eastern coast, where it will stay quite grey for much of the day, whilst much of the country will have a fine day, plenty of sunny spells and temperatures lifting into the low 20s. Still chilly along eastern coast with that northeasterly breeze here. On Monday evening, we've got plenty of sunshine before dusk, and then as we head towards midnight and overnight, we see the low cloud pushing back in once again. A bit of deja vu here, thick enough for a little bit of light rain and drizzle in places, but perhaps pushing a little further westwards than previous nights. Under any clear spells, particularly across western Scotland, Northern Ireland, temperatures here on the chilly side, and so quite a grey start to Tuesday morning. Best of the sunshine, western fringes of the UK, much of Northern Ireland, and then just like the last few days, we'll see that low cloud slowly push back. It may take longer, so some central and eastern parts of England staying on the cloudy side. Best of the sunshine in the west. Further sunshine Wednesday and Thursday, temperatures in the low 20s. See you again later.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels... First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.